Let's start with a question that may unsettle anyone who believes that the world order of the past century is still intact. What if the United States has already lost strategic control of its own hemisphere and just hasn't acknowledged it yet? In 2025, Venezuela represents a shift that should make us reconsider everything we thought we knew about the Western Hemisphere. While debates over elections, inflation, and cultural wars dominate the U.S., something much more significant is happening quietly in the Caribbean. Russian military aircraft are now landing on Venezuelan airstrips. Russian warships dock in Venezuelan ports, not just for symbolic visits, but for ongoing operations. Russian military advisors are deeply embedded in the Venezuelan military, training officers, maintaining weapons, and integrating command structures. This is not a distant prediction or speculation. It's happening right now. For nearly 2 centuries, American power rested on the belief that no foreign great power could establish a lasting military presence in the Western Hemisphere. This wasn't just policy, it was a psychological boundary as well as a military one, central to U.S. strategy. But now, here we are. Russia, a sanctioned power supposedly weakened by war and isolation, is operating freely in the U.S. geopolitical backyard with the full consent of a sovereign Latin American state. Washington, despite its protests, sanctions, and declarations, has been unable to stop this. That is the true crisis. The turning point isn't simply that Russia has sought this foothold, it's that U.S. policies helped create it. Decades of pressure, embargoes, and regime change efforts didn't bring about the fall of Venezuela's government. Instead, they pushed Venezuela into a strategic alliance with America's rivals, turning the Caribbean into a new theater of multipolar competition. Now, this is not a story about ideology. It's about power, desperation, and unintended consequences. It's about how states behave when they are cornered and how empires discover too late that coercion has its limits. If you still believe the Monroe Doctrine governs the Western Hemisphere, Venezuela should terrify you. If you believe in the permanence of American supremacy, Venezuela should force you to rethink everything. And if you think that global power shifts are always dramatic and loud, you are already behind the curve, because history rarely shouts. Sometimes it quietly docks at a port and stays. And that is why we need to talk about Venezuela. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our insights and strategic breakdowns. The biggest revelation, one that most of the public doesn't yet see, is this. Venezuela is no longer simply aligned with Russia. It has been structurally fused with it, and once you understand this, everything changes. Many media outlets portray Russia's presence in Venezuela as opportunistic or symbolic, an occasional provocation, or a geopolitical stunt. But this framing is dangerously incomplete. What we are witnessing is not a short-term, flexible alliance. It's a deep, irreversible entanglement. Venezuela's military, security, and survival mechanisms are now so thoroughly integrated with Russian systems that untangling them would collapse the Venezuelan state itself. This is the factor that changes everything. Venezuela doesn't just host Russian forces. It depends on Russia for its very survival as a sovereign military power. Its aircraft cannot fly without Russian parts. Its air defenses cannot function without Russian technicians. Its command structures rely on Russian training pipelines. And its deterrence against external intervention exists primarily because Russia's presence raises the cost of action for Washington. This is not an alliance of convenience. It is dependency by design. And here's the uncomfortable truth for American audiences. This dependency didn't emerge because Russia outsmarted the U.S. militarily. It emerged because a U.S. strategy focused obsessively on punishment while neglecting the structure of Venezuela's political and military systems. Washington assumed that pressure alone would weaken the regime, but what it actually did was hollow out alternatives, leaving Russia and China as the only reliable pillars holding up Venezuela's government. From that moment on, every new sanction, every rhetorical escalation only strengthened the logic of Russian involvement. Moscow didn't need to conquer Venezuela. It simply needed to make itself indispensable, and it did so with patience, precision, and minimal cost. This is why the usual responses no longer work. You cannot sanction away a military that runs on foreign systems. You cannot diplomatically isolate a government that is backed by 2 permanent members of the UN Security Council. You cannot coerce a reversal when such a reversal would mean the collapse of the Venezuelan state. The public debate in the U.S. still asks the wrong questions. Will Russia leave? Can sanctions be tightened? Will the regime fall? The correct question, however, is far more disturbing. What happens when American power is no longer decisive, even in its own hemisphere? Because Venezuela is not an anomaly. It is a demonstration of what happens when a sanctioned state crosses the point of reintegration and is forced to survive through alternative power structures. It shows that multipolarity doesn't announce itself with declarations. It arrives through logistics, maintenance contracts, fuel shipments, training manuals, and quiet docking rights. The central thesis, then, is not that Russia is winning in Venezuela. It is that the contest itself has already changed form. This is no longer a battle for influence. It is a contest for entanglement. It is no longer about persuasion. It is about replacement. It is no longer about deterrence. It is about dependence. And once a rival power becomes structurally necessary rather than politically optional, the balance of power has already shifted whether we acknowledge it or not. To understand why Venezuela became the stage for this strategic rupture, we must step back and confront a longer chain of decisions. These decisions were made incrementally, often with confidence, and always under the assumption that American power was self-enforcing. This story doesn't begin with Russia. It begins with policy inertia. After the Cold War, the U.S. Treated the Western Hemisphere as geopolitically settled. The Monroe Doctrine was no longer debated because it was assumed Latin America was viewed less as a strategic theater and more as a managed space where economic leverage, financial access, and diplomatic pressure were all that was needed to shape outcomes. This assumption proved fatal. When Venezuela began drifting away from Washington's sphere of influence in the early 2000s, the U.S. response was not engagement, but escalation. Sanctions replaced diplomacy. Isolation replaced negotiation. Regime change became an objective, not a hypothetical outcome. Every action taken was justified as temporary, reversible, and corrective. But geopolitics is not linear. It's adaptive. By progressively severing Venezuela from Western markets, finance, technology, and legitimacy, U.S. policy did not just create pressure, had created necessity. A state cannot simply stop functioning because it is sanctioned. It must either collapse or substitute. Venezuela chose to substitute. As access to Western oil services evaporated, Russian firms filled the gap. As dollar transactions became impossible, alternative payment channels emerged. As diplomatic isolation deepened, Venezuela turned to Moscow and Beijing for political and military support. At every stage, Washington interpreted Venezuela's survival as defiance. But for Venezuela, it was adaptation under siege. And here's where the deeper error lies. American strategy assumed that pressure would translate into compliance. It rarely does. More often, pressure leads to reorientation. History offers countless examples of this dynamic. States under pressure do not dissolve, they restructure their dependencies. When pressure becomes overwhelming, alignment hardens, and when exit ramps are removed, alternatives become permanent. By the time the U.S. formally recognized opposition leadership and pursued regime replacement, Venezuela had already crossed the threshold. Survival now required external protection, and only one power was willing to provide military deterrence without political conditions: Russia. This is where the logic flips. Once Russian military systems became embedded, once training, maintenance, and doctrine shifted, cost of reversing course became prohibitive. Venezuela could no longer return to its previous Western alignment without dismantling its entire military. Alignment with Russia was no longer a matter of ideology. It was a matter of mechanical necessity. Meanwhile, China played a complementary role where Russia provided military protection. China provided financial support and long-term infrastructure investments. Russia brought guns and defense capabilities while China offered loans and economic lifelines, with Venezuela repaying them in oil exports. This two-pronged support system, combining Russian military capacity and Chinese economic absorption, formed a robust ecosystem that was immune to Western pressure. Together, Russia and China helped ensure Venezuela's survival. But it wasn't just survival, it was survival under a new structure. The deeper cause of Venezuela's alignment with these powers wasn't ideological or a direct response to Russian ambition. It was a strategic miscalculation rooted in the U.S. unipolar thinking, the belief that no alternatives could exist, that sanctions and pressure alone would always outweigh the possibility of substitution. The U.S. assumed that American dominance was so entrenched that it didn't require constant maintenance. But as history has shown, dominance is not a natural law, it's a relationship, and that relationship decays when it's replaced by coercion alone. What we're witnessing in Venezuela is not a sudden betrayal of the United States. It is the delayed consequence of policies that closed doors faster than they offered viable alternatives. Policies that assumed time was on Washington's side when in reality it was working against it. This is how geopolitical shifts are born, not through dramatic defeats, but through accumulated certainties that quietly expire over time. If this story feels abstract, let the numbers help ground it. Venezuela's economic collapse since 2013 is staggering. The country's GDP has shrunk by roughly 70 to 75%, with more than 3 or 4 of its national economy vanishing in less than 2 decades. Hyperinflation reached astronomical levels over 1 million% annually, wiping out the national currency, savings, wages, and pensions. The social consequences are just as severe. By 2025, an estimated 6 to 7 million Venezuelans had fled the country, making this one of the largest displacement crises in modern history. Now, consider oil the backbone of Venezuela's economy. In the late 1992, Venezuela produced over 3 million barrels of oil per day. By 2025, that figure had plummeted to around 750,000 barrels per day, a nearly 75% decline. The fall was driven by mismanagement, corruption, brain drain, and crucially, U.S. sanctions that severed Venezuela's access to Western technology, capital, and markets. Yet, despite all of this, the state has not fully collapsed. Why? Because Venezuela continues to export oil through alternative channels facilitated by Russian logistics and intermediaries using non-doll payment systems. Estimates suggest that even with sanctions, Venezuela still manages to export close to 900,000 to 1 million barrels per day. These oil shipments, made possible by Russia's support, help fund the Venezuelan state's military and its survival despite economic ruin. Switching focus to the military dimension, Venezuela has purchased over $15 billion worth of Russian military hardware since the mid-2000s. Its air force operates 24 Su-30 fighter aircraft, Russian helicopters, armor, and missile systems. The country's strategic air defense relies on advanced S-300 systems. And between 2024 and 2025, Russian strategic bombers capable of carrying nuclear payloads conducted long-range deployments to Venezuelan air bases, engaging in joint drills and Caribbean operations not seen since the Cold War. On the naval side, Russian warships equipped with missiles have made repeated port calls in Venezuela, staying for weeks at a time to conduct operations. Venezuelan ports have become essential logistical nodes for Russian forces, used for maintenance, resupply, and crew rotations. This is a significant shift. Venezuela is no longer a client state of Russia. It has become an operational platform for Russian military power. And this transformation happened while the U.S. watched, aware, alarmed, but constrained in its responses. Washington responded with its usual tools, statements, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, but none of these were calibrated for a situation where escalation carried unacceptable risks. Confronting Russian forces directly in the Caribbean would invite a crisis neither side wanted, and one the U.S. could not easily justify to its own public. So the pressure plateaued. From Caracas's perspective, this was confirmation. Russia's presence was no longer hypothetical. It had become protective. As the Venezuelan government openly declared Russia its strategic ally and the U.S. its adversary, the shift was sealed. Russia's involvement in Venezuela became a low-cost, high-lever move. For a fraction of what Moscow spends in Europe or Asia, Russia had secured a strategic distraction for the U.S., forcing the Pentagon to divide its attention and demonstrating global reach despite the sanctions. Russia shattered the assumption that the Western Hemisphere was geopolitically sealed off from great power rivalry. China, meanwhile, remained more restrained, but no less decisive. As tensions rose in Venezuela, Chinese oil purchases continued, financing channels stayed open, and infrastructure projects moved forward. Beijing didn't need to confront the U.S. militarily. It benefited from the stability provided by Russian deterrence, allowing its economic interests to deepen without triggering direct confrontation. This convergence of Russian military presence and Chinese economic support formed a powerful axis that reshaped the region. The combination of Russian military backing and Chinese economic involvement had one critical effect. It turned Venezuela into a key node in multipolar competition within the Western Hemisphere. Washington, once the unquestioned hegemon in the region, now faced a geopolitical reality where U.S. power was no longer uncontested. The tools that once enforced American dominance, sanctions, military deterrence, and diplomatic isolation had lost their potency. Venezuela was no longer just a rogue state defying American pressure. It had become a symbol of how great power competition had arrived at America's doorstep, not through military conquest, but through invitation. This is the real turning point that many in the U.S. have missed. The crisis is not that Russia defied the United States. The crisis is that Washington discovered it no longer had the ability to enforce the boundaries it once took for granted. The Monroe Doctrine was not challenged by force. It was eroded by facts on the ground, by logistics, contracts, maintenance crews, oil shipments, and decisions accumulated over years. Once those facts were in place, no speech, no sanction, no diplomatic action could erase them. The result is a strategic stalemate. The U.S. retains overwhelming power but lacks usable options. Military escalation risks war with Russia, while economic escalation produces diminishing returns. Diplomatic isolation fails because Venezuela is no longer isolated. The tools of American dominance no longer align with the new reality in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's transformation is not just a regional issue, it radiates outward, affecting not just its own future, but the entire region and the world. Inside Venezuela, the result is paradoxical, a government that survives with external military and economic support, but a society that continues to collapse. Russian military backing has ensured the survival of the Maduro government, but only the government. The political center holds, but the social fabric continues to deteriorate. The regime survives not because it has regained legitimacy, but because its collapse has been artificially delayed. The country is now trapped in a state of managed decay. Venezuela's economy functions just enough to fund the power structures, but not enough to rebuild society. It is a country too supported to fall, but too damaged to recover. And as long as Venezuela remains dependent on Russian and Chinese support, this cycle will continue. At the regional level, Venezuela is no longer a cautionary tale. It is a proof of concept. It demonstrates that U.S. pressure can be survived if alternatives exist. That sovereignty can be preserved not by alignment, but by diversification. Governments throughout Latin America now see options: Russian weapons without political conditions, Chinese financing without governance demands. These are viable alternatives. Even countries with close ties to the U.S. are learning the lesson: never rely on a single pole of power. This erosion of assumptions is what will change the landscape across the region. The idea that U.S. displeasure is decisive, that sanctions can isolate a country, and that the Western Hemisphere is strategically unified under U.S. leadership. Those assumptions are crumbling. Once those assumptions collapse, influence becomes negotiable. And once influence is negotiable, competition enters spaces that were once uncontested. Globally, Venezuela marks a critical inflection point. For the first time in decades, great power rivalry has returned to the Western Hemisphere. Not through invasion, but through invitation. Russia did not impose itself. It was invited in as a protector. China did not confront the U.S. directly, but instead built parallel systems beneath it. This is what multipolarity looks like in practice: overlapping networks of logistics, finance, and security that dilute enforcement power. The real danger is not Venezuela itself, it's the spread of this model. If other Latin American states learn from Venezuela's experience and adopt a similar strategy, the entire region could transform into a strategic marketplace. Influence will no longer flow in one direction. Power will be distributed more equally, and the United States will no longer have the automatic ability to enforce its will. In this new world order, the Monroe Doctrine has faded into history. The question now isn't whether American supremacy survives, it's whether adjustment happens deliberately or under pressure. As Venezuela shows, empires do not collapse due to direct assault. They weaken when they confuse punishment with control. Venezuela may not mark the end of American influence, but it marks the end of an era when that influence was guaranteed. Thank you for watching Strike Force Analysis. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you never miss our latest military and geopolitical analysis. See you in the next video.